Thank you, Chair Lozano, and members of the board. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in the meeting today. I know my time is limited, so I'm going to keep the comments with respect to the findings in the audit report at a very high level. I know many of you are very familiar with the findings, but I will step through about four or five key issues that we identified in the report, and then really focus on the recommendations, not only those we've made to the Board of Regents, but also certainly to the Office of the President. So starting with the findings in the report, the Office of the President, the first finding is related to the $175 million that we identified that was in surplus. Essentially, at the end of fiscal year 15-16, we identified $175 million. Now, much of that, $83 million, as we said in the report, is a restricted funds used for certain purposes, state grants. There were certain types of restrictions associated with those dollars. On the flip side, the $92 million is essentially discretionary money that the Office of the President has the ability to use for a variety of purposes. And certainly, as we were in discussions with the Office of the President, they discussed some $54 million of commitments. And those are again, initiatives, types of expenditures that certainly seem to be reasonable. However, as we state in the report, those are not decisions that were made by the board, by the regents. This is information and decisions that are made exclusively by the Office of the President. So we felt that there needed to be more transparency around those decisions and some of those expenditures. Also, there was $38 million in discretionary funds, and that wasn't committed to any particular purpose. And again, we discussed with the Office of the President, there should be an appropriate reserve. We don't dispute that, but what should that reserve amount be? And at this point in time, or at the point in time we completed the audit, the Office of the President really hadn't established a reserve policy or what an appropriate reserve amount would be. So that was one of the concerns, and when I touch on the recommendations, we'll talk about that. We certainly looked at budgeting practices, and we're really concerned about several weaknesses in the budgeting practices for the Office of the President. We use NACUBO. I'm sure you're all familiar with National College University Budget Officers standards and recommended best practices. Also GFOA, which is a government finance organization that also has best practices. So the types of things we weren't seeing in the budgeting process, practices by the Office of the President, is when they presented a budget to the board, it didn't include prior year expenditures, so you didn't really know if what you approved in the prior year, how much of that had been expended, how much was left over, what the full funding sources were for the variety of resources and revenues that were coming into the Office of the President. I touched on the reserve policy. There was no reserve policy. Limited stakeholder input into decision-making with respect to the budget. No long-term forecasting, and then monitoring expenditures. What we learned from the Office of the President is they do that maybe midpoint of the year rather than perhaps quarterly or even monthly review of expenditures to really keep a handle and an idea on how the budget, how the expenditures are going and how the budget is looking. And certainly expected to see more guidance and more protocols and procedures related to approval of expenditures. We looked at a sample of about $42 million in expenditures, and we could not find appropriate support for $34 million. And I will tell you the same thing I told the legislature. We didn't necessarily see anything nefarious in those expenditures that we tested. But again, we were not able to find appropriate documentation and support for that decision making and who actually approved or what the official approval was for those expenditures. So that really needs to be tightened up. The third issue is related to the system-wide initiatives. Again, here's where we had concerns, not necessarily about the nature and the purpose of those initiatives, but the fact that when we asked the Office of the President to start out with, how many system-wide initiatives do you have? The first answer they gave us was 32. Then we went back to them and my staff said, well, we're seeing some other initiatives on your website and some publications that aren't included in this list. So my staff came up with a list of 79 is what we present in the audit report. And looking at the budget that you're going to be addressing today, I see a list of 35. So there needs to be a real definitive process for identifying what are system-wide initiatives and what's the purpose of those initiatives. And certainly another discussion we have in the report is, and let's assess those initiatives. So very important initiatives, let's understand what the purpose and intent is. Also track how much is being spent on those initiatives, either by the Office of the President or certainly at the campus level, and then what's the benefit that is being derived from that particular initiative. Is it a positive thing? Is it an initiative we need to continue to fund, or the university system needs to continue to fund, or is it an initiative that needs to be dialed back? There are some initiatives in some of the budget documents that my office reviewed in prior years where it was determined that some of these initiatives are so successful they're essentially self-sufficient. UC Press was mentioned in one of your previous budget documents as an initiative that really has been very, very successful to the point where it could be self-supporting. So perhaps money for that particular initiative could be used for others. So really wanting to expect or see the Office of the President able to identify all of the initiatives, understand the purpose, the intent, track how much is being provided, how much is actually being spent. The other issue that the legislature asked us to look at was staffing size and the cost of staff at the Office of the President. And we really didn't see sufficient support for decision-making as far as the number of staff at the Office of the President. It's a little over 1,600 individuals. Now, credit to President Napolitano. When she came in, she asked for really a hard look at all of the operations of the Office of the President, including staffing. What we expected to see is some real documentation and analysis of that. Unfortunately, we didn't see much coming out from that. She gave a very specific directive, and in fact, after that, where there were decisions or there were expectations that perhaps there would be identification of duplication of effort, et cetera, the staffing levels at the Office of the President actually increased. So we really were, again, in the audit report, discussing the importance of strategic planning, workforce planning. We used the state's model, the California Department of Human Resources uses for state agencies in California, and really emphasizing workforce planning and the importance of that. So we talked about that in the audit report. The last issue, as I'm sure you're all well aware, was the process we attempted to survey campuses to identify the resource or the services that the Office of the President provides, and to get a handle on how well the campus, how many of those services the campuses were actually using, and then their perspective. Are some very, very beneficial? Are some you don't use? You may be a small campus, you use more services than perhaps a large campus. To really try to get a handle on the broad range of services that are provided, do they all need to be continued? How beneficial are they? That was the other piece of the surveys, to try to understand the nature and value of those services. The second survey we sent to the campuses was related to the campus assessment, asking campuses if they understood the methodology for how that assessment is determined and their perspective on the campus assessment. Do they feel they're getting value from what they're paying the Office of the President for those services? And as clearly has been discussed, and I understand the Regents had a meeting last week to talk about hiring someone to do a fact-finding mission, we certainly had concerns based on the evidence that we had. And my responsibility under the standards my office operates is we saw enough interference that we could not rely on the results of those surveys, and I had to disclose that in the audit report, and that's what I did. So I don't know that we need to belabor that. I certainly can answer questions related to that. But that's the last issue. Now, we did make recommendations to the Board of Regents, and I do want to acknowledge Chair Lozano, Mr. Perez, and Ms. Zettel met with me at least 2 or 3 times during the course of the audit, really wanted to understand some of the issues we were raising, really seemed very committed, as I'm sure all of you are, to addressing the recommendations that we made in the report. So I certainly appreciate those efforts. The recommendations we made to the Regents was to hire an outside third party to assist in monitoring and overseeing the corrective action plan, and I'll go through that. We came up with what we think is a very reasonable time frame, a 3-year corrective action plan for the Office of the President to address all of the recommendations in the report, and I will go through those, and I'll try to keep them at a high level. So certainly hiring an independent third party to assist you folks in monitoring implementation of the corrective action plan. The other key recommendation is that we hope that the Regents will hold a public meeting like this to allow stakeholders to really engage and discuss all of the system-wide initiatives so that people understand the purpose and intent and can give their personal opinion as to whether or not those are the best and highest use of certain resources. And then certainly a recommendation to continue overseeing the Office of the President as you do to make sure that some of this change really does take place. As far as recommendations to the Office of the President, as I said, we came up with what we think is reasonable, a 3-year plan. The first year would be items that we would expect the Office of the President to complete by April of 2018, then subsequently April 2019, April 2020. And really the first year for all areas, the budget, the staffing, system-wide initiatives, is really get a handle on things. Identify what initiatives you have out there, what the purpose is, how much you're spending on those initiatives. Really do a better job of presenting the budget to the regents, including prior year expenditures, following some of those best practices that we actually identified in the audit report. And then second year is just continuing to develop and improve and develop policies. And then third year is hopefully you're getting to a point where it's becoming standard practices. I can certainly go into all the detail. I know time is precious. The one concern I do want to raise, I do appreciate the President's commitment to implementing all 33 recommendations. One thing I do want to make sure that I share with the Regents today is a concern we have. We felt we came up with a very reasonable, flexible schedule with respect to implementing these recommendations. But out of the 33 recommendations, 9 of them in the response we received from the Office of the President, they changed the deadline from April to July. The April deadline we think was very important because of the budget cycle, not only for the Office of the President and the Regents to be considering budgets, but for the legislative cycle. As you all know, we made a recommendation to the legislature to consider a direct appropriation for the Office of the President. If the Office of the President is implementing some of these recommendations and they're not going to do it until July, that's too late. The state budget is already done. And with all due respect, we don't agree with pushing those deadlines out, and we certainly feel that giving an entire year and actually a 3-year window to fully implement all these recommendations is more than reasonable. Some of the other recommendations where the deadline was changed was related to the system-wide initiatives. And again, we think the budgeting and the system-wide initiatives are really key recommendations. So we're disappointed to see, and we commented in the audit report, that moving those dates out from April to July we really don't think is reasonable and is appropriate. Particularly, I mean, I think that's true of 18, but certainly true of 19 and 20. I don't know how you can determine that you can't implement something by April 19 when we're sitting here in May of 2017. So with all due respect to the Office of the President, we do have concerns about that. With that, Chair Lozano, I think I don't want to take up too much time, but I'm certainly, and Kathleen Fullerton, I apologize, did not introduce her. She was the audit manager on this particular project, so any questions the Regents may have about our work, we're happy to answer them. Thank you.